Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Listen, what I'm about to tell you kept me awake last night. 8 people walked into small Appalachian towns in November. Only their stories made it out. These places look normal during the day, but when November hits, something wakes up. Something that's been waiting. Hit subscribe right now, smash that like button, and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Trust me, you'll want company after hearing these stories. Let's go. I'm 35, and I've been running Murphy's Market here in Pine Valley, North Carolina, for the better part of a decade now. If you've never heard of Pine Valley, well, that makes sense. We're tucked away in a hollow between 2 ridges about 40 miles west of Asheville, the kind of place you only find if you're looking for it or if you're lost. My grandfather opened this store back in 1963, and my father ran it until his heart gave out when I was 27. That's when I came back from Charlotte, left my accounting job to keep the family business alive. Pine Valley used to be something. Back in the 60s and 70s, we had close to 2,000 people living here. Logging kept us going, then a small textile mill, then nothing much at all. By the time I took over, we were down to maybe 800 souls. Now, in 2018, we're hovering around 650 on a good day. Most of the young folks head to the cities after high school. Can't blame them. There's not much here for them anymore. Murphy's Market is the last grocery store in town. Food Lion pulled out in 2009, IGA closed in 2012. We're it. And I'll be honest with you, we're hanging on by our fingernails. The profit margins are razor thin, especially in winter when the tourist money dries up and people drive 40 minutes to Walmart for their monthly shopping. November has always been make or break for us. Those Thanksgiving sales carry us through January and February, or we'd be boarding up the windows come Christmas. This November felt different from the start, though I couldn't put my finger on why. There was something in the air, like the pressure change you feel before a bad storm, except no storm was coming. The leaves had fallen early this year, carpeting Main Street in browns and golds that seemed too bright, too saturated, like an old postcard that had been overdeveloped. It started small. Tuesday, November 13th, around 3 in the afternoon. I was restocking the bread aisle when I heard the bell above the front door. Normal enough sound. Except when I looked up, I saw a woman I didn't recognize. In a town this size, that's unusual but not impossible. Could be someone visiting family, or maybe someone who'd moved here recently that I just hadn't met yet. She was maybe 60 years old, wearing a navy blue dress with small white flowers on it. The dress looked handmade, well-crafted, but the style seemed old-fashioned in a way I couldn't quite place. She moved through the store slowly, studying the shelves with the kind of intensity you'd expect from someone shopping in an unfamiliar place. "Excuse me," she said when she approached the counter. Her voice had that soft Appalachian lilt that gets stronger the further back in the hollers you go. "Do you happen to carry Sunshine crackers?" I'd never heard of them, but that wasn't unusual. People ask for specific brands all the time. "I don't think so, ma'am, but I can check our distributor catalog and see about ordering them for you." Her face lit up. "Oh, that would be wonderful. I'm planning a big family dinner for Thanksgiving, and my grandmother's dressing recipe calls for Sunshine crackers specifically." She passed the recipe down to me, and I've been making it the same way for as long as I can remember. I wrote down the name and her phone number. Though when I looked at it later, I realized it was only 7 digits, the old format from before area codes became mandatory in our region. When I asked her about it, she seemed confused, then rattled off the same 7 numbers again. The next day brought another unfamiliar face, a man, this time maybe 45, wearing clean work clothes that had a timeless quality to them. Sturdy cotton pants and a flannel shirt that could have been from any decade between 1950 and now. He wanted something called Carnation Instant Breakfast. "It's for my boy," he explained. "He's been sickly, and the doctor said the vitamins in that breakfast mix might help build him up. My wife's been asking all over the county for it." Again, I wrote down the product name and promised to check with our distributor. The man nodded gratefully and headed for the door, then stopped and turned back. "This is a nice little store you've got here," he said. "Reminds me of Murphy's from when I was growing up. Old Murphy himself used to give us kids penny candy." "Your grandfather, I imagine?" I nodded, even though something felt off about the way he said it. My grandfather had indeed given out penny candy. but he died in 1987. This man didn't look old enough to have been getting candy from him as a child. Thursday brought 3 more customers asking for products I'd never heard of. A woman wanting something called screaming yellow zonkers, a snack food, she said. An elderly man looking for carnation instant milk, insisting it was different from the regular powdered milk we carried. A young mother asking for funny face drink mix in goofy grape flavor. I called our distributor that afternoon. Mike Stevens had been supplying our store for 12 years, and he knew the grocery business inside and out. Tom, I'm looking at these product names you gave me, and I've got to tell you, most of these companies went out of business years ago, decades ago, in some cases. I could hear him typing on his keyboard. Sunshine Crackers? That company folded in 1996. Screaming Yellow Zonkers haven't been made since the early 80s. And Funny Face Drink Mix. Christ, Tom, that stuff disappeared when I was in middle school. But these customers seem to know exactly what they want, I said. They're not confused about the names or anything. They know these products specifically. Look, maybe they're remembering brands from when they were kids. Sometimes older folks get nostalgic for things that aren't made anymore. You could try finding similar products from current manufacturers. But when I suggested substitutes to the customers, they politely declined. They wanted the original brands, they said. They'd wait for me to find them. By the following Tuesday, I had a list of nearly 30 discontinued products that people had requested. All of them were brands that had vanished between the 1,970 seconds and 1,990 seconds. And all of the customers were people I'd never seen before in 8 years of running the store. That's when I started paying closer attention to details. The woman in the navy dress came back on Wednesday. This time, I noticed that her clothes weren't just old-fashioned, they were pristine. The fabric looked new, unworn, like she'd just bought the dress. But the style, the cut, the way the buttons were shaped, everything about it screamed 1,970 seconds. The man looking for carnation instant breakfast returned too. I watched him more carefully this time. His work boots were leather, well-maintained, but the sole pattern was wrong. Modern work boots have complex tread designs for better grip. His looked like something from an old Sears catalog. And the money. Every single one of these customers paid with cash, but it wasn't normal cash. The bills were too crisp, like they'd just come from the bank, but some of them had designs I hadn't seen in years. I found a $5 bill with Abraham Lincoln's memorial on the back instead of the Lincoln Memorial, a design that was changed sometime in the early 2000s. The coins were even stranger. They felt heavier in my hand, and some of them had dates from the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds. But they looked newly minted. No wear, no tarnish, no accumulated grime from decades of circulation. Friday afternoon, I was organizing the cash drawer when I really looked at what I'd collected over the week. Mixed in with the normal money were bills and coins that told a story spanning 4 decades. But they all looked like they'd been printed yesterday. I started making notes, not just about the products people were requesting, but about the people themselves. The woman in the navy dress had mentioned making her grandmother's dressing recipe for as long as I can remember. But when I thought about it, she didn't look old enough to have been making Thanksgiving dinner in the 1,970 seconds, when Sunshine Crackers were still being manufactured. Saturday brought a family I'd never seen before. Parents and 3 children, all dressed in what I was starting to recognize as that timeless, pristine clothing style. The father asked for something called Kugel peanut spread, while the mother wanted Tang breakfast crystals in a flavor called Orange Plus. The children, 2 boys and a girl, maybe 8 to 12 years old, were perfectly behaved in that formal way kids used to be taught. They stood quietly while their parents shopped, hands clasped behind their backs, speaking only when spoken to. "This is a nice store, mister," the little girl said to me when her family approached the counter. "Do you know if you'll be open on Thanksgiving Day?" "No, sweetheart. We'll be closed so folks can spend time with their families." She nodded solemnly. "That's good. Families should be together on Thanksgiving." After they left, I found myself standing at the front window, watching their car drive away. It was a station wagon, boxy and practical, but something about it looked wrong. Too clean, too unchanged, like it had just rolled off the assembly line. That's when I realized I should look up some of these customers. Pine Valley is small enough that we still have a local historical society run by Mrs. Ethel Blackwood out of the back room of the library. She's been collecting photographs, newspaper clippings, and family histories for 40 years. If these people were locals, or had been locals at some point, she'd have records. I closed the store early on Sunday and drove to Mrs. Blackwood's house on Maple Street. She invited me in for coffee and listened while I described some of the customers I'd been seeing. The woman in the navy dress with white flowers, I said. About 60 years old, soft-spoken, mentioned making her grandmother's dressing recipe. Mrs. Blackwood went quiet for a moment, then got up and pulled a photo album from her bookshelf. She flipped through pages of black and white and early color photographs until she found what she was looking for. This her? The photograph was from the Pine Valley Gazette, dated the 28th of November, 1978. The caption read, "Mrs. Dorothy Henderson displays her prize-winning cornbread dressing at the annual Thanksgiving community dinner." The woman in the photo was wearing a navy blue dress with small white flowers. She was maybe 30 years old in the picture, which would make her 70 in 2018. But the woman who'd been shopping in my store looked exactly like the woman in this 40-year-old photograph. Mrs. Henderson passed away in 1995, Mrs. Blackwood said quietly. House fire on Thanksgiving night. Took her whole family. Husband Robert, their 2 children, and Dorothy herself. Terrible tragedy. My hands started shaking as I held the photograph. What about the man in the work clothes, mid-40s, asking for Carnation instant breakfast for his sick son? More page-turning, more searching through decades of community photographs. Finally, another picture from the Gazette. Here, Robert Coleman died in a mining accident in 1982. That's his wife, Sarah, next to him, and their boy, Tommy. The man in the photograph was exactly the man who'd been shopping in my store, down to the flannel shirt and work boots. Same face, same age, same concerned expression when he talked about his sickly boy. We spent the next hour going through photographs. Every customer I described, Mrs. Blackwood, found in her archive. All of them had died between 1975 and 1995. All of them had been Pine Valley residents. All of them looked exactly as they had in their final photographs, unchanged by the decades that had passed since their deaths. I drove home that Sunday evening, feeling like the world had shifted underneath me. Everything looked the same. The familiar curve of Holbrook Road, the old Methodist church with its white steeple, the cluster of mailboxes at the bottom of my driveway, but nothing felt solid anymore. Monday morning, I opened the store as usual, but I was watching for them now. Waiting. They came. Mrs. Henderson arrived first. Still in that navy blue dress, still asking about sunshine crackers. I told her they should be in by Wednesday, and she smiled that same grateful smile. Robert Coleman came next, checking on the Carnation instant breakfast. Behind him were the family with the 3 well-behaved children, then the elderly man wanting instant milk, then others. Some I'd seen before, some I hadn't. I started paying attention to conversations, really listening to what they said to each other when they thought I wasn't nearby. "Haven't seen you since the church potluck," Mrs. Henderson said to a woman I hadn't met yet. "How's your mother's arthritis?" asked Robert Coleman to the elderly man. "Tell your wife I said hello," the family patriarch told Mrs. Henderson. "She makes the best green bean casserole in the county." They were talking about people and events like they were current, present-day happenings. But I knew from Mrs. Blackwood's records that most of these people had been dead for decades. Tuesday brought a realization that made my stomach drop. I was watching the family with the 3 children, really studying them this time, when I noticed something I'd missed before. The children weren't aging. The youngest boy had the same smooth, unmarked face he'd had the week before. No scrapes, no bruises, no evidence of the rough and tumble life that kids live. They looked like photographs of children come to life. That afternoon, I called Mrs. Blackwood. "Ethel, I need to ask you something, and you're going to think I'm losing my mind." "Try me, Tom." "The people in those photographs, when they were alive, did they shop at Murphy's Market?" A long pause. "Well, of course they did, honey. It was the only grocery store in town back then, just like it is now. Your grandfather knew all those families personally. Do you remember what they used to buy? Their regular purchases?" Another pause, longer this time. "That's an odd question, Tom, but yes, I suppose I do remember some things." Dorothy Henderson always bought those sunshine crackers for her dressing. Made the best Thanksgiving meal in Pine Valley. And Robert Coleman, poor man, he was always buying special things for that sickly boy of his. Doctor had recommended some kind of breakfast supplement. The phone slipped in my sweaty hand. Carnation instant breakfast? That's it exactly. How did you, Tom, is everything all right? I hung up without answering. Wednesday, November 21st. The day before Thanksgiving, I opened the store at 6 a.m. as usual, but there was already a line of customers waiting outside, not the usual handful of early shoppers picking up forgotten items. Dozens of people, maybe 50 or more, all standing quietly in the pre-dawn darkness. As I unlocked the door, they filed in politely, orderly, like they were entering a church service. I recognized most of them now from Mrs. Blackwood's photographs. The dead of Pine Valley, come to do their Thanksgiving shopping. They filled their carts with massive amounts of food. Not just the discontinued products they'd been requesting. Those items had mysteriously appeared on my shelves overnight, delivered by no truck I could remember, but everything. Turkeys, hams, potatoes, cranberry sauce, pie fillings, vegetables, bread, milk, butter. The cash register rang constantly. By noon, I'd processed more transactions than I usually saw in a month. The total climbed higher and higher, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, and they kept coming. More customers than Pine Valley had living residents, all buying food for massive family gatherings. I started recognizing patterns in their purchases. The families were buying enough food for relatives who had died decades apart, spanning generations of the lost dead. Mrs. Henderson bought groceries for 15 people. Robert Coleman's cart contained enough food for a gathering of 30. Every customer seemed to be planning for extended family reunions that defied the laws of mortality. Around 3 p.m., I started counting. Over 200 people had shopped in the store that day. Pine Valley only had 650 living residents, including children and elderly people who rarely left their homes. The math was impossible, but the most impossible thing was how normal it all felt. These dead customers chatted with each other like old friends, which they were. They asked about family members, shared recipes, discussed the weather and local news. They were polite to me, grateful for my service, patient when lines formed at the register. At closing time, 8 p.m., 2 hours later than usual, I counted the day's receipts, $47,000 in sales, more than our best month ever. But as I was organizing the bills, something was wrong with the money itself. The 20s were all from 1,977. The 10s were from 1,983. The 5s were from various years throughout the 1,972nd and 1,982nd. But none were newer than 1,995. And they all looked newly printed, uncirculated, like they'd come straight from the Bureau of Engraving to my cash drawer. I tried calling the bank to ask about depositing such old bills, but my cell phone wouldn't work. No signal, even though the tower was just 5 miles away on Sunrise Ridge. The landline in the store was dead too, just a steady dial tone that wouldn't connect to anything. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all that money, all those impossible customers, all those families preparing for Thanksgiving dinners that couldn't happen. Around midnight, I got dressed and drove back to the store. Main Street was dark, except for the streetlights, but I could see a glow coming from inside Murphy's Market. I'd locked up hours ago, turned off all the lights, set the alarm. But there was definitely light coming from inside. I used my key to enter, disarming the alarm system that somehow hadn't detected the interior light. The store was empty, but warm, like it had been full of people recently. The cash register drawer was open, and when I looked inside, my evening's receipts had turned to ash. Not burned, exactly, just transformed into fine gray powder, like the bills had aged 40 years in 6 hours. Thanksgiving morning, I woke up and drove to check on the store again. Every shelf was empty. The refrigerators and freezers were cleaned out. Nothing remained except the basic store fixtures and a thin layer of that gray ash covering every surface. But the front door was still locked. The alarm system showed no breaches. The security cameras, installed just last year, showed no activity after I'd left the night before. According to the electronic records, we'd had 0 sales on November 21st. I drove through Pine Valley that morning, and every house was lit up for Thanksgiving. Houses where I knew the owners lived alone. Houses where families had moved away years ago. Houses that had stood empty for decades. All of them showing signs of massive family gatherings. I parked across from the Henderson place on Birch Street. The house had been abandoned since the family died in 1995, windows boarded up, yard overgrown. But that morning, it looked like it had 40 years ago. Fresh paint, manicured lawn, smoke coming from the chimney, and cars in the driveway that matched the vintage of the clothes my customers had been wearing. Through the front window, I could see the family gathered around a dining room table set for 20 people. Dorothy Henderson was serving her prize-winning dressing, made with sunshine crackers. Robert Coleman was there with his wife and son, along with other families I'd served during the week. All of them eating food that had come from my store, paid for with money that had turned to ash. I tried to call the police, but Officer Martinez just told me I'd been working too hard. "Tom, you need a vacation. Maybe see someone about stress. All this talk about dead people shopping. It's not healthy." When I asked him to drive by the Henderson house with me, he said it had been condemned years ago. That I was confused. Nobody else remembered the impossible shopping day. Nobody else saw the family gatherings. According to everyone in Pine Valley, it had been a perfectly normal, quiet Thanksgiving week. I spent that Thanksgiving alone in my empty store, sitting on the floor between the bare shelves. The silence was complete. No customers, no traffic, no sounds from the houses where impossible dinners were taking place. Around 6 p.m., the front doorbell chimed. Mrs. Henderson walked in, carrying bags full of leftover food. Behind her came Robert Coleman, then the family with the 3 children, then others. All of them returning items from their Thanksgiving dinners. "Need to return some things," Mrs. Henderson said pleasantly. "We overestimated how much food we'd need." My hands moved without my conscious control, taking the returned items and restocking the shelves. Turkey that had been carved and eaten was somehow whole again. Pies that had been served and consumed were back in their original boxes. Vegetables that had been cooked and seasoned were fresh and raw once more. The customers filed out as quietly as they'd entered, leaving me alone in a store that was suddenly, impossibly, fully stocked again. Everything was exactly as it had been before the Thanksgiving rush, except for one thing. When I looked at my reflection in the front window, something was wrong. I was there, but fainter than I should be, like a photograph that had been overexposed. I could see through myself to the empty street beyond. The next morning, Pine Valley was back to normal. The Henderson house was boarded up again. The other houses showed no signs of the previous day's gatherings. Our store inventory was complete, our books balanced, and nobody remembered anything unusual about the week. But each day since then, my reflection has gotten a little fainter. I can see through my hands now when I hold them up to the light. When I speak, sometimes people don't hear me the first time, like my voice is coming from very far away. I understand now what's happening. Pine Valley's dead don't just return for Thanksgiving. They're building something, a tradition, a ritual, a bridge between their world and this one. And they need someone on this side to make it work. Someone to sell them groceries with phantom money, to stock shelves with impossible products, to maintain the illusion that everything is normal. Every year, the November customers return. They shop for brands that don't exist anymore, paying with money from decades past, preparing for family dinners that span the divide between life and death. And every year, I become a little more like them. I still run Murphy's Market. The store made it through that winter somehow, our books mysteriously balanced, despite the impossible economics. Customers from the living world still shop here during regular business hours, buying normal products with normal money. But in November, when the leaves turn and the air pressure changes and that familiar feeling returns, I prepare for the other customers. The ones who remember when Murphy's Market was young, when Pine Valley was thriving, when families stayed together across generations. Mrs. Blackwood stopped by last week. She looked at me for a long time before speaking. "Tom," she said finally, "you're starting to look like someone I might put in my photograph collection someday." I nodded. "I know what I'm becoming. The grocer who serves both the living and the dead, who bridges the gap between what Pine Valley was and what it's trying to remain. And honestly, I'm not fighting it anymore. This town was dying anyway, all its young people leaving, all its history fading away. At least this way, everyone gets to come home for the holidays. Even if they can't really stay, The Thanksgiving rush starts again next week. I've already ordered the Sunshine Crackers and Carnation Instant Breakfast, though I don't remember calling any distributors. They'll be here when Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Coleman arrive, along with all the other families who refuse to let death interrupt their traditions. I just hope there's enough of me left to ring them up. After all, everyone deserves a proper Thanksgiving dinner, even the dead. I was 31 the year I stopped guiding hunters altogether. Been making my living taking city folks into the mountains around Blackwater, Kentucky for 8 years by then, ever since I got laid off from the coal mine. Blackwater's one of those places that looks like a postcard from the road. Population 417, according to the sign. Neat little houses tucked into the valley, church steeple pointing up at the ridgeline. What the sign doesn't tell you is that we're surrounded by thousands of acres of forest that stretches back into hollows where the old families used to live, before the mines played out and everyone moved closer to town. November's always been my bread and butter. Deer hunters from Louisville, Cincinnati, sometimes as far as Chicago, willing to pay good money for a guide who knows the deep woods. I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. Black bears, sure, had a client step on a copperhead once. Hell, I'd even found human bones back in the old settlement areas, probably some ancestor who wandered off and never made it home. But I'd never encountered anything that made me question what was real and what wasn't until that group from Chicago hired me. Marcus Chen, David Rodriguez, and Tim Walsh. 3 guys in their 40s who carried way more gear than any weekend hunting trip required. Military-grade GPS units, satellite phones that didn't work anyway in the deep hollows, cameras with night vision capability. They said they were documentary filmmakers looking for authentic wilderness footage, but something felt off about the whole arrangement. They'd specifically requested the most remote area I knew, said they wanted to get as far from civilization as possible. When they offered to pay triple my normal rate, I figured they were just serious about having an authentic mountain experience. I should have trusted my instincts and turned them down. I took them 12 miles deep into Copper Ridge Hollow, farther back than I usually guide clients. There's an old mining road back there that hasn't seen regular use since the 1960 seconds. Just 2 dirt tracks, now mostly grown over with saplings and blackberry bramble. My grandfather worked those mines before they closed, told me stories about the families who used to live back in the hollow before the company bought them out. The forest gets thick quick once you leave that road. The kind of thick where you can lose sight of your partner 20 feet away, where the canopy blocks out so much light it feels like perpetual twilight. We set up camp near where the old road dead ends at Caney Creek, figuring we'd have good water access and a clear path back to my truck. The clients were nervous energy from the moment we stopped moving, kept checking their equipment, testing battery levels on devices that wouldn't get signal anyway. Marcus kept mentioning something about baseline measurements, which didn't make sense for a hunting trip, but I was getting paid whether they shot anything or not. The first night went normal enough. Built a fire, cooked some beans and cornbread, talked about where we'd start hunting in the morning. The Chicago guys were jumpy though, startling at every normal forest sound. Owls calling, branches creaking in the wind, the distant splash of something drinking from the creek. Around 10 o'clock, we turned in. I've always been a light sleeper when I'm guiding. You learn to listen for problems, animals getting into food, clients wandering off to relieve themselves, and getting turned around in the dark. That's why I was wide awake at 2:17 a.m. when I heard something moving through the trees. It was big, definitely bigger than a person. The footsteps crunched through the fallen leaves with deliberate weight, but the rhythm was completely wrong for any animal I knew. A black bear would shuffle and snuffle, stopping to investigate smells. A deer would bound, light and quick. This thing was walking with a measured pace, too long between steps, like something with legs that were stretched out way too long for its body. Each footfall landed with precision, as if it was being very careful about where it stepped. I lay there in my sleeping bag for maybe 15 minutes, listening to it circle our campsite in a perfect loop about 50 yards out. It never got closer, never moved away, just maintained that exact distance while it walked around and around us. The sound would fade as it moved to the far side of the circle, then grow louder as it came back around toward the creek. 7 complete circuits before it finally moved away deeper into the hollow, footsteps fading until there was nothing but the normal night sounds again. Come morning, I found the tracks. They were pressed deep into the soft mud at the creek's edge, where something had stood drinking or just watching our camp. Human-shaped, but nearly 2 feet long and 8 inches wide. 5 toes, but they were stretched out like someone had grabbed them with pliers and pulled until the bones separated. The depth of the impressions suggested something that weighed at least 400 pounds, but the stride length between prints was over 6 feet. My clients wanted to pack up and leave right then. Marcus went white as a sheet when he saw the tracks, started talking about contaminated research data and compromised baseline conditions. But I convinced them it was probably just a black bear. Bears can leave weird tracks sometimes, especially in soft mud where their claws spread the print. I didn't believe it myself, but I needed the money, and honestly, I was curious. In 8 years of guiding these mountains, I'd never seen anything like those prints. The second day hunting, I started noticing the forest getting quiet. When you spend as much time in the woods as I do, you get used to the constant background symphony. Birds calling to each other across the canopy, squirrels chattering and rustling through the leaves, insects buzzing, the distant drumming of woodpeckers. But as we moved deeper into the hollow that morning, following an old game trail that wound between massive oak and hickory trees, it all just faded away. By noon, we were hiking through absolute silence. The air felt thick and wrong, like trying to breathe through wet cotton. Every breath took effort, and there was a metallic taste that coated the back of my throat. Temperature dropped maybe 15 degrees from what it should have been for November, and I started noticing my GPS acting up, coordinates jumping around randomly even when we were standing still. We found more of those stretched footprints leading deeper into the trees, and something else that stopped me cold. Trees with bark stripped off in perfect spirals, starting about 4 feet off the ground and winding upward 15 or 20 feet. The spirals were exactly 6 inches wide and looked like they'd been carved with fingernails, but fingernails the size of railroad spikes, way higher than any known animal could reach, and too precise to be natural damage from weather or disease. Tim tried to film one of the marked trees with his camera, but the footage came out completely black even though we were standing in broad daylight. David's GPS started showing our location as somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Marcus's expensive radio equipment picked up nothing but static, even on emergency frequencies that should have been clear. That evening around the fire, we heard our own voices calling from the forest. Clear as day, Marcus's voice yelling from the direction of the creek. "Hey, come here, I found something incredible." But Marcus was sitting right beside me, roasting a hot dog on a stick, staring at me with wide, frightened eyes. Then David's voice from the opposite direction, higher up the ridgeline. "Jake, bring the first aid kit." But David was 3 feet away, hadn't moved in 20 minutes. The voices kept calling for maybe an hour, using our exact intonations, our speech patterns, even inside jokes from earlier conversations. But always from different directions, always trying to lure us away from the fire and into the dark forest. Whatever was out there was studying us, learning how we communicated, testing to see if we'd respond to familiar voices, calling from the shadows. None of us slept much that night. We took turns keeping watch, 2 awake and 1 trying to rest, but every time someone started to drift off, we'd hear footsteps circling the camp again. Same measured pace, same perfect 50-yard distance, but now there were multiple sets. At least 3 different gates, maybe more, all walking in synchronized circles around our fire. The third morning, I woke up to find our gear arranged in perfect geometric patterns. Backpacks, rifles, cooking equipment, even our boots. Everything laid out in these intricate designs that looked like crop circles but made from our belongings. Concentric rings with our sleeping bags in the center, radiating lines of camping supplies extending out like spokes on a wheel, smaller circles of personal items connected by precise lines of scattered ammunition. And the smell hit us then, sharp and chemical mixed with rotting meat, like battery acid poured over roadkill that had been sitting in the sun for weeks. It was so strong it made our eyes water, so thick you could taste it on your tongue. That's when Marcus admitted what they really were. Not documentary filmmakers. Researchers from the University of Chicago, part of a team investigating reports of anomalous humanoid encounters in remote Appalachian locations. They'd received dozens of witness accounts from Copper Ridge Hollow over the past 5 years. Hikers, hunters, Even some of the old-timers from Blackwater, who still remembered the families that used to live back in the deep woods. We thought it was just local folklore, Marcus said, hands shaking as he tried to pack his equipment. Shared cultural memory, psychological projection onto unfamiliar environments. We never expected, he gestured at the geometric arrangements of our gear. We never expected anything like this. They'd been taking measurements since we arrived. Electromagnetic readings, infrasound detection, air quality analysis. All their instruments had been showing completely impossible data. Temperature fluctuations that violated basic physics, magnetic field distortions that should have required industrial-grade equipment to produce, sound frequencies below the range of human hearing that somehow still made us feel nauseated and disoriented. We decided to hike back to the truck, but the mountain wouldn't let us leave. Every path led us in circles. My GPS showed we were walking straight north toward the old mining road. But somehow we kept ending up back at our campsite. 3 times we tried different routes, using my compass, following the creek, even attempting to bushwhack straight through the forest. 3 times we found ourselves staring at those perfect circles of our belongings. The 4th time, we realized something was moving the campsite itself. Not just our gear, but the entire clearing where we'd set up. Trees that should have been to our east were now south. The creek bend that had been 30 yards from our fire was now barely 10 feet away. The landscape was shifting around us, being rearranged like furniture in a room, keeping us trapped in a space that no longer followed normal geographic rules. That's when we saw it clearly for the first time. Standing between 2 massive oak trees maybe 50 yards from our camp, motionless as a statue but unmistakably alive. 8 feet tall, with pale gray skin that looked waxy and stretched tight over 2 long bones, arms that hung down past its knees, ending in those impossibly long fingers we'd been seeing prints of. Its head was tilted at an angle that would snap a human neck, 45 degrees to the left like a curious dog. But the eyes were completely black and reflected no light at all. It was watching us with the patience of something that had been alive for centuries, studying our behavior like a scientist observing laboratory specimens. When it noticed us staring back, it slowly raised one elongated arm and tried to wave. The gesture was jerky and wrong, like something that had watched humans from a distance and was trying to copy our social behaviors without understanding their purpose or meaning. Its fingers didn't move together as a unit but separately, each digit following its own rhythm, creating a rippling motion that hurt to look at directly. Then it spoke, not with vocal cords, but with a sound like grinding metal that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The words were in English, but pronounced with inhuman precision, each syllable separated by exactly the same pause. Why do you stay here when I call you to come into the trees? David and Tim started shooting. Emptied their rifles at the thing, but the bullets seemed to pass right through it without any effect. It didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge the gunfire at all, just kept watching us with those black hole eyes and that broken neck tilt to its head. When they ran out of ammunition, it tilted its head the other direction, 45 degrees to the right this time, and made that grinding sound again. You will stay here. You are part of this place now. By the 4th day, more of them appeared. 3 distinct entities, all roughly the same size and build, but with subtle differences. One had longer arms that dragged on the ground when it walked. Another moved with a stuttering gait, stopping and starting unpredictably. The third one's skin had a greenish tint and seemed to be covered in some kind of moss or lichen. They would stand at the edge of our vision during daylight hours, always maintaining that perfect 50-yard distance, walking in synchronized circles around our camp. They left more evidence of their presence. Stone cairns built from creek rocks with what looked like human teeth balanced on top. Symbols carved into tree bark that seemed to shift and change when we weren't looking directly at them. Marcus's equipment detected massive electromagnetic spikes whenever they appeared, readings that should have fried every electronic device in a 100-yard radius, but somehow didn't. The temperature would drop 20 degrees in seconds, and the air would develop that metallic taste again, so strong it made our gums bleed. That's when I realized what was really happening. These things weren't trying to hurt us. They were claiming us, marking us as permanent residents of their territory. We weren't visitors anymore. We were specimens in their collection, native wildlife that belonged in Copper Ridge Hollow and would never be allowed to leave. I found red cloth strips tied around our sleeping bags while we slept on the fourth night. None of us remembered seeing any red fabric in our gear. The strips were knotted with mathematical precision, and when I tried to untie one, it crumbled to dust in my hands, leaving a red stain that wouldn't wash off my fingers. They were patient, ancient. They'd been in these mountains longer than human settlement, maybe longer than humans had existed at all. The old mining families hadn't been bought out by the coal company. They'd been claimed by these things, absorbed into whatever impossible ecosystem existed in the deep hollows. The company had just built roads to access areas that were already empty, land that had been feeding these entities for generations. On the fifth morning, Marcus made a discovery that changed everything. His instruments detected a pattern in the electromagnetic distortions, a repeating sequence that occurred every 12 hours. For exactly 17 minutes each time, the readings would return to normal levels. During those windows, our GPS would work correctly, showing accurate coordinates and clear paths back to the mining road. "It's some kind of feeding cycle," he whispered, voice hoarse from 4 days of breathing that poisoned air. "They're dormant during the transition periods. That's our chance." We waited for the next window, gear packed and ready to run. When the readings dropped to normal at 6:23 a.m., we bolted. 17 minutes to cover 12 miles of rough mountain terrain. We ran like our lives depended on it, which they did, following my GPS through forest that suddenly made geometric sense again. Creek crossings that led where they were supposed to lead, ridgelines that stayed in the same relative positions, trails that connected logically instead of looping back on themselves. We made it to the truck with maybe 90 seconds to spare. As soon as we reached the old mining road, we felt the change. The air cleared, the metallic taste vanished, and the normal sounds of the forest returned. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, insects buzzing. My truck started on the first try, radio picked up stations from 3 counties away, and Marcus's equipment showed completely normal readings. But when I looked back toward Copper Ridge Hollow, I could see them. Standing at the edge of the tree line where the forest met the road, watching us leave. Not angry, not disappointed. Patient. They knew we'd figured out their schedule, discovered the 17-minute gaps in their control. But they also knew something we didn't want to admit. We'd been marked, tagged, made part of their inventory. The red stains on my fingers never faded completely. Even now, 5 years later, if I hold my hand up to the light, I can see faint traces of that impossible color. Marcus and the other researchers published their findings in some obscure academic journal, but the paper was retracted within 6 months. Insufficient peer review, the university said. Methodological concerns. I don't guide hunters anymore. Started working construction instead. Something where I never have to spend nights alone in the deep woods. Moved away from Blackwater completely, up to Lexington, where there's enough city noise to drown out the dreams. But sometimes, especially in November, I'll wake up at exactly 2:17 a.m. with the taste of metal in my mouth and the sound of synchronized footsteps circling my house. Marcus sent me a letter last year. Said his team had tried to return to Copper Ridge Hollow with better equipment, more researchers, plans to document everything properly this time. They never made it past the old mining road. Their GPS units died the moment they left the truck. Compasses spun wildly, and they could hear their own voices calling from the forest before they'd even set up camp. They lasted 3 hours before retreating. The thing is, I know they're still there, still patient, still collecting specimens for whatever purpose entities like that have. And sometimes, late at night when the rest of Lexington is asleep, I can feel them testing the boundaries of their territory, expanding outward, getting bolder, looking for the specimens that got away. I keep a bag packed by my front door now, change of clothes, basic supplies, enough cash to get me across state lines quickly. Because I know they'll come for me eventually. Not to hurt me, but to bring me home to Copper Ridge Hollow, where I belong. Where I've always belonged, ever since that first night when they marked me as one of their own. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that my escape was never really an escape at all. It was just a longer leash, a way to study how far their specimens would travel before the pull of home became too strong to resist. And every November, that pull gets a little stronger. Back when I was 26, I was working the graveyard shift as a janitor at Millfield High School in western North Carolina. This was 2019, right after my divorce got finalized and I'd moved back to the mountains where I grew up. Millfield's one of those Appalachian towns that's been slowly dying since the textile mills closed in the 90s. Population down to maybe 650 people, most of them getting older every year. The high school only had around 180 students. Kids bussed in from all the hollow communities scattered through these hills. I'd taken the janitor job because it was honest work that paid decent for the area, and frankly, I needed the solitude. My ex-wife used to say I was too quiet, too comfortable being alone, and maybe she was right. The night shift suited me perfectly. Clock in at 10 p.m., clean the entire building, lock up around 6 a.m., go home and sleep while the rest of the world went about their business. No small-town gossip, no well-meaning neighbors asking how I was holding up, just me and my cleaning cart making our way through those long, empty corridors. My grandfather had been the head groundskeeper at Millfield back in the 1962 when the place was first built. He used to tell stories about the construction, how they'd had to level part of an old family cemetery to make room for the foundation. Said the county moved all the marked graves to the new cemetery up on Miller's Ridge, but there were always rumors about unmarked plots they might have missed. Poor families back then sometimes buried their children without proper headstones, especially if the child died young or was born different somehow. Granddaddy never spoke much about what different meant, just that some folks preferred their family business stay buried and forgotten. The building itself had that institutional feel you'd expect from 1962 architecture. Long cinder-block hallways painted in faded yellow and green, fluorescent lights that hummed constantly, and that particular smell of floor wax and old textbooks that every school seems to have. During the day, it felt normal enough. But at night, when all those voices and footsteps and locker slams went quiet, the place took on a different character entirely. Sound carried differently through empty hallways. Shadows fell at odd angles. The heating system made noises that could sound almost like whispers if you let your imagination run. November was always the worst month for night shift work. Something about those long, dark nights and the way the mountain fog would roll down and press against the windows made everything feel more isolated, more cut off from the living world. The students would come back from Thanksgiving break talking about family stories, old mountain legends their grandparents had shared around dinner tables. Tales of things that lived in the deep hollows, creatures that had been in these mountains since before the Cherokee, before anyone. I didn't put much stock in that kind of talk, but working alone in that empty building, it was hard not to let those stories creep into your head. November 22nd started like any other shift. I badged in at the main entrance at exactly 10 p.m., grabbed my cart from the supply closet, and started my usual routine in the West Wing. Math classrooms first, room 201 through 208, then science, then English. I had the whole process down to a system after 2 years of doing it. Empty the trash, wipe down the desks, clean the whiteboards, mop the floors, move on to the next room. The work was almost meditative once you got into the rhythm of it. Around midnight, I was finishing up the last math classroom when I heard what sounded like children laughing. Not unusual in itself. Sometimes teachers left their computers on, or there'd be a video still running on one of the smartboards. But when I followed the sound down to the cafeteria, the room was dark and silent. I checked the kitchen, flipped on all the lights, even looked out at the parking lot to see if maybe some teenagers were hanging around outside. Nothing. I went back to my cleaning, but the sounds continued. Distant footsteps echoing through the hallways behind me, lockers slamming shut somewhere in the building. The soft murmur of voices that would stop the moment I tried to listen closer. At first, I figured it was just the building settling, or maybe the old heating system kicking on and off. These mountain schools were notorious for their ancient HVAC systems that could sound like a freight train when the temperature dropped. But as the night wore on, I started feeling like I wasn't alone anymore. It's hard to explain that sensation to someone who's never experienced it. You know how you can sense when someone's watching you, even when you can't see them? That prickle on the back of your neck, that instinct that tells you you're being observed? It was like that, except it followed me from room to room. I'd be mopping a classroom floor, completely focused on my work, and suddenly every hair on my body would stand up. I'd turn around expecting to see a security guard or maybe a teacher who'd stayed late, but there was never anybody there. Just empty desks and dark hallways stretching away into nothing. In the math wing, I found chalk writing on whiteboards I'd already cleaned. Not words or equations. Strange geometric symbols, spirals that seemed to fold in on themselves, stick figures with too many limbs that bent at impossible angles. The drawings looked primitive, like something a small child might make. But there was something wrong about the proportions. The figures were unnaturally tall and thin, their limbs extending in directions that hurt to look at. I erased everything and moved on to the next classroom, but when I came back through 15 minutes later, the drawings were there again. Exactly the same, like someone had traced over them with perfect precision. That's when the real uneasiness started setting in. November 23rd, the pattern repeated but intensified. I'd hear my name being called from different parts of the building. Carlos, Carlos, come here. But the voice was wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. It had the higher pitch of a child's voice. But underneath there was something adult about the vocal cords, something that spoke of years and experience no child should have. The words came with too much breath behind them, too much control, like someone who'd learned to speak by listening to recordings rather than natural conversation. I started finding evidence that something was studying the building, learning its patterns. Handprints on the windows, but with 4 fingers instead of 5. And those fingers were impossibly long, stretching across entire panes of glass like spider legs. The prints left behind a greasy residue that wouldn't come off, no matter what chemicals I used. I went through an entire bottle of industrial cleaner on just one classroom window, scrubbing until my arms ached. But the marks remained clear as ever. More disturbing were the small changes to my routine. My cleaning cart would be rearranged in patterns I hadn't created, supplies lined up by height, bottles turned so all the labels faced the same direction, everything organized with an almost obsessive precision. I'd find my own footprints in the dust leading to places I'd never been, down dead-end hallways, into storage rooms I didn't have keys for. Like something had been practicing my walk, studying my gait and stride length, learning to move through the building exactly like I did. That's when I discovered the room in the basement. I'd been working at Millfield for 2 years and thought I knew every square inch of that building. But that night, while checking the boiler room for a strange scratching sound, I noticed a door I'd somehow overlooked. It was tucked behind the main heating unit, painted the same industrial green as the walls, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. The door was unlocked, which seemed odd for a school that was normally strict about security. Beyond that door lay a classroom that time had forgotten. The room looked exactly like something from the 1960 seconds, when the school was first built. Wooden desks, arranged in perfect rows, all facing a large chalkboard covered in those same geometric symbols I'd been finding upstairs. But there was something wrong with the architecture itself. The walls seemed to curve inward slightly, as if the entire room was being slowly compressed by some enormous, invisible weight. The air felt thick and stale, like it had been trapped down there for decades. The bulletin boards were covered with children's drawings, but not the kind you'd expect to see in a normal classroom. These were pictures of tall, pale figures with arms that reached down to the ground, their fingers trailing like roots or vines. Things that might have once been human but now moved like broken marionettes, all stiff joints and unnatural angles. In every drawing, these figures stood among trees that looked exactly like the mountains around Millfield, as if the children had been drawing what they saw outside their windows. Every piece of artwork was signed with careful, childish handwriting: Sarah Jenkins, Michael Clearwater, Jennifer Goines, Tommy Mullins, names that carried the weight of old Appalachian families. But when I later checked those names against the school's historical records, I found something that made my blood run cold. Every single one of those children had attended Millfield Elementary in the fall of 1967. But none of them had lived to see Christmas. They'd all died during a flu outbreak that swept through the mountain communities that November, taking mostly the youngest and weakest. According to the newspaper archives, 13 children from the surrounding hollows had died within a 3-week period. The county had been overwhelmed. Not enough doctors, not enough medicine. Families too poor to seek help until it was too late. Most of those children had been buried in small family plots scattered throughout the mountains, simple graves marked with wooden crosses that had long since rotted away. But here were their drawings, their careful signatures, pinned to bulletin boards in a classroom that shouldn't have existed. November 24th. I realized I was being actively studied. The sensation of being watched intensified into something almost physical. I could feel eyes tracking my every movement as I worked, learning how I held my mop, how I arranged my supplies, the exact order in which I cleaned each room. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, tall, thin shapes that would vanish the moment I turned to look directly at them. But the presence was always there, patient and observant, like a predator studying its prey. I started finding evidence that something was practicing being me. My cleaning supplies would be rearranged into configurations I'd never used, but somehow more efficient than my own system. Trash cans would be emptied and cleaned better than I'd ever managed. Floors would show mopping patterns that matched my technique, but executed with an inhuman precision. It was as if something had been watching me work for weeks, memorizing every detail, and was now trying to replicate my job with mechanical perfection. The most unsettling discovery came when I found my own handprints pressed into the dust on surfaces I'd never touched. Storage room shelves, the top of the gymnasium scoreboard, even on the ceiling tiles in the main office. But these weren't quite right either. The proportions were slightly off, the finger spacing just a little too wide, as if something had been trying to recreate my hands from memory and hadn't quite gotten the anatomy correct. That night, I caught my first clear glimpse of what was learning to be me. I was cleaning the windows in room 214 when I saw a reflection that shouldn't have been there. A tall, impossibly thin figure standing behind me, holding a mop in the same position I held mine. But its arms bent at angles that human arms simply couldn't achieve, and its movements were stiff and mechanical, like watching someone operate a marionette with too many strings. It was copying my motions exactly, but with the uncanny wrongness of something that understood the mechanics of human movement without comprehending the biology behind it. When our eyes met in the reflection, it tried to smile at me. The expression stretched across its face like it was being pulled by invisible wires, too wide, showing far too many teeth, holding the position for several seconds too long. It was the smile of something that had observed human expressions, but had never felt the emotions that created them. I dropped my mop and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck in the parking lot, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. When I finally managed to start the engine and looked back at the school, I could see that figure standing in the window of room 214, still holding the mop, still attempting that horrible, too wide smile. November 25th changed everything. I arrived for my shift to find my time card already punched and my locker already opened. Someone, or something, had been there before me, going through my things, studying the personal items I kept in my workspace. My thermos had been filled with coffee, but it was coffee I'd never bought, with a taste that was almost right but somehow fundamentally wrong, like someone had tried to recreate the flavor from a description rather than actual experience. The building was spotless. Every surface gleamed with a perfection I'd never achieved in 2 years of working there. The floors were so clean they seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights. Every trash can was not just empty but sanitized. Even the windows sparkled with a clarity that made the dark mountains outside look unnaturally sharp and detailed. But most disturbing of all was what I found in the basement classroom. The children's drawings had changed. The tall, pale figures were no longer standing among the mountain trees. Now they wore janitors' uniforms. They pushed cleaning carts, they held mops and spray bottles, and in the corner of each drawing, barely visible in pencil, was a new signature, Carlos Rivera. I never worked at Millfield High again. I called in sick the next day, then the day after that. By the end of the week, I'd found work at a furniture factory down in Morganton, 40 minutes away from those mountains. The pay was worse and the hours were longer, but at least I worked during the day, surrounded by the noise and chatter of other human beings. I never told my supervisor why I really quit. What could I have said? That something was learning to replace me? That the ghosts of children who died 50 years ago were somehow teaching it how? Instead, I made up a story about family obligations and better opportunities elsewhere. But the truth is, I was scared. Not just of what I'd seen, but of what it meant. If something could learn to be me so perfectly, how would anyone know the difference? How would I know the difference? 3 years have passed since I left Millfield. I drive past the school sometimes when I visit my mother, who still lives up in those mountains. The building looks the same from the outside, but I've heard rumors around town that they're having trouble keeping night staff. The county says they've hired 3 different janitors since I left, but none of them lasted more than a few weeks. Folks who know them say they just stopped showing up one day. No explanation, no forwarding address. But the building stays clean, the grass gets mowed, the snow gets cleared from the walkways. When I drive by at night, I can see lights moving through the windows, methodical and precise, working room by room through the same routine I used to follow. Last month, I ran into Frank Messer at the grocery store. Frank's been the day maintenance supervisor at Millfield for 15 years, knows that building better than anyone. He pulled me aside and asked if I'd ever noticed anything strange during my time there, anything that might explain why they couldn't keep night staff. I told him no. Said it was just a quiet job in an old building, nothing more. But before we parted ways, Frank mentioned something that's been eating at me ever since. He said that sometimes, when he arrives early in the morning, he finds things that don't make sense. Cleaning supplies arranged in patterns nobody taught their current staff. Work completed with a level of detail and precision that seems almost inhuman. And once, just once, he'd found a time card punched for an employee they'd never hired, someone named Carlos Rivera. Weird thing is, Frank had said, according to our records, we never had a night janitor by that name. Computer system doesn't show anybody ever working those hours. Like whoever was doing that job just disappeared from the records entirely. I haven't been back to Millfield since that conversation. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still there. Still learning, still perfecting the art of being human, one routine at a time. And I wonder if maybe, in those children's drawings pinned to bulletin boards in a basement classroom that officially doesn't exist, there are new signatures appearing. New names of people whose jobs it's learning to do, whose lives it's learning to replace, whose existence it's gradually erasing from official memory. I wonder if someday, someone will tell Frank Messer that they never had a furniture factory worker named Carlos Rivera either. That, according to the records, I never existed at all. I was 30 when I learned that some places in the mountains don't want to stay connected to the outside world, and that November in Appalachia brings more than just early snow and shorter days. My name's David Park, and for 6 years, I'd been fixing cable and internet lines for communities scattered through the West Virginia hills, places where folks still wave from their porches and remember when a phone call meant walking to the general store. I thought I knew every kind of equipment failure you could imagine. Ice storms that snapped lines clean, bears that treated utility poles like scratching posts, copper thieves who'd strip a junction box bare in the middle of the night. But what started happening in Millbrook that November, looking back now, I realize it wasn't equipment failure at all. It was something learning how to use our equipment for purposes we were never meant to understand. Millbrook sits in a valley about 40 minutes up Route 19 from Beckley, population 280 on the census, but closer to 200 most days, when you account for the kids who moved away for work and the old-timers who spend winters with family down in the flatlands. I'd been servicing that area for 3 years, knew the terrain like my own backyard. Mrs. Henderson always had fresh coffee brewing when I showed up to check her connection, and old Pete at the hardware store would spend 20 minutes telling me about every deer he'd seen that week. Normal mountain folk living normal mountain lives. But every November, without fail, I'd get these service calls that didn't quite make sense. Brand new equipment showing wear patterns like it had been in service for decades. Cables with perfect bite marks that didn't match any animal I could identify. Junction boxes found wide open with all the components arranged in neat little piles, like someone had been taking inventory. I always chalked it up to seasonal changes. Mountain humidity does weird things to electronics, and you'd be surprised how creative teenagers can get when they're bored. November 19th started with a call I'll never forget. Dispatch told me the entire Copper Mountain Road neighborhood had lost signal simultaneously at exactly 3:17 a.m. Not gradually, not house by house like you'd expect with a spreading problem, but all at once, like someone had thrown a switch. That pointed to the main junction box, so I loaded up my truck and headed up the mountain. The junction box was mounted on a utility pole about half a mile past the last house, right where the road curves through a stand of old-growth pines that block out most of the sky even on sunny days. Soon as I pulled up, I could see the metal housing hanging open like a broken jaw. But it wasn't pried open or cut. The metal was torn from the inside out, bent and twisted in ways that spoke of incredible strength applied with surgical precision. Every single cable had been pulled out and arranged in perfect spirals. Not randomly twisted like you'd see with vandalism or animal damage, but geometrically precise coils that decreased in diameter as they spiraled inward, each one exactly the same size as the others. It looked like mathematical art, like someone had been practicing sacred geometry using our infrastructure as their canvas. I stood there for a long time, just staring. In 6 years of this work, I'd never seen anything like it. The pattern was too complex for random damage, too purposeful for accident, but too strange for normal human vandalism. It was beautiful and wrong at the same time, and looking at it too long made my eyes water like I was staring into bright light. The woods around me were absolutely silent. No bird calls, no insect noise, not even the whisper of wind through the pines. Just my breathing and the distant hum of traffic on the main highway below. But while I was standing there trying to make sense of the damage, I started feeling watched. You know that prickling sensation you get when someone's staring at the back of your neck? It was like that, but stronger. Like multiple someones, all watching from different directions. That's when I noticed the footprints in the soft mud around the base of the utility pole. They were almost human. The right general shape and size, but the proportions were off in ways that made my stomach clench. Too narrow, with toes that stretched out impossibly long, ending in what looked like points rather than rounded tips. And they circled the pole exactly 13 times. I counted twice to be sure, before disappearing into the tree line in a perfectly straight path that headed deeper into the mountains. I did the repair work as fast as my hands could manage, splicing cables and reconnecting components, while that watched feeling crawled up and down my spine like spiders. Every few minutes I'd catch myself glancing toward the woods, expecting to see something looking back, but there was never anything there. Just shadows that seemed a little too deep and trees that stood a little too still. The drive back down the mountain felt like escaping something, though I couldn't have said what. November 20th brought another call to the same location. Same junction box, same impossible damage, but this time the pattern was different. The cables were woven together in a series of perfect triangles connected by smaller spirals, like someone was learning a new language and practicing their letters. The utility pole itself bore fresh marks, deep gouges carved in specific patterns that looked almost like writing. If writing could be done with claws and possessed an alphabet I'd never seen. While I worked on repairs, my truck radio started picking up interference. Static at first, crackling and popping like a campfire, then gradually resolving into voices. Clear, distinct conversations that shouldn't have been on any frequency my equipment could receive. "The mountain paths are opening again," one voice said, and the tone was wrong somehow, too flat, like someone reading phonetically from a script they didn't understand. "November brings the thin places. Learning their connection methods," another voice responded. "The tall ones need better signals to reach the underground networks. Practice first, copy their patterns until we understand. Then improve." I spun the dial, trying to find a clear frequency, but the voices followed me across every channel. They were discussing our communication systems like scientists studying insects, clinical and detached, trying to understand how we use technology to stay connected to each other. The whole time I listened, a metallic taste was building in my mouth, sharp and bitter, like sucking on old pennies. The air felt thinner too, like being at a much higher altitude than I actually was. I found myself breathing harder, my heart beating faster, though I wasn't exerting myself. Something about being in that spot was affecting me physically in ways I couldn't explain. November 21st brought multiple calls from residents throughout Millbrook. Their televisions were showing programs that didn't exist. Old shows from the 1000, 950 seconds, and 60 seconds, but with scripts that were subtly wrong. Familiar actors saying unfamiliar lines, laugh tracks that came at the wrong moments, commercials for products that had never been manufactured. It was like someone was studying our entertainment, learning how we told stories and sold products, but getting the details just slightly off. Mrs. Henderson called to tell me her TV was showing the same episode of I Love Lucy over and over, but each time Lucy's dialogue was different. She'd tried changing channels, but every station was showing the same modified episode. "It's like someone's rewriting it," she said, and her voice had a tremor I'd never heard before, like they're trying to get it right. I spent that entire day climbing utility poles throughout the service area, checking signal boosters and amplifiers. That's when I found them. Devices attached to our equipment that had never been manufactured by any company I knew. They looked organic, not grown exactly, but shaped like they'd been formed rather than assembled. Smooth surfaces that pulsed with dim, rhythmic light, warm to the touch and slightly yielding, like touching living tissue. When I tried to remove one, it seemed to retreat deeper into the cable housing, flowing like liquid into spaces too small for it to physically occupy. It was merging with our infrastructure, becoming part of the network itself. And as it integrated, I could hear new sounds coming from the cables, not electrical hum, but something that sounded almost like breathing. November 22nd. I realized our entire communication system was being hijacked. Whatever was doing this wasn't destroying our network, it was improving it, expanding it, turning it into something far more complex than anything humans had designed. My work truck's GPS started displaying roads that didn't appear on any map, phantom pathways through the mountains leading to coordinates that shouldn't exist. The GPS voice, usually a bland female tone, occasionally glitched into something else, deeper, with pronunciation that suggested a mouth shaped differently than human mouths. The voices on my radio were becoming more frequent and more detailed. They discussed connection protocols for the deep places and signal amplification for transdimensional communication. They talked about learning human networking methods to bridge the gap between worlds and establishing permanent relay stations in thin places where the barriers are weak. Each conversation made less and less sense to my human understanding, but somehow I was beginning to grasp the underlying concepts. They were using our technology as a foundation to build something vastly more sophisticated, a communication network that could reach beyond our physical world into spaces that existed parallel to ours, places where different laws of physics applied and different forms of consciousness dwelt. November 25th, I followed one of the phantom roads on my GPS. It led me up into parts of the mountains I'd never seen before, though I'd thought I knew every accessible trail in the area. The road surface felt real enough under my tires, but when I looked in my rearview mirror, I couldn't see any sign of the path I'd just traveled. The GPS showed my location as a place called Relay Station 7 Alpha, though no such designation existed in any utility company database. The road ended in a clearing that shouldn't have been possible. It was perfectly circular, about 100 yards across, filled with utility poles that formed geometric patterns when viewed from above. But these weren't any poles installed by human crews. They were taller than normal, made from some kind of wood that looked almost metallic, and the cables running between them hummed with energy that made my teeth ache. Underground, massive cables formed patterns that were visible from surface disruptions in the earth. Symbols and pathways that covered the entire clearing in designs that hurt to look at directly, like optical illusions that tried to drag your perception into impossible dimensions. And there were figures tending the network. They moved between the equipment with the purposeful efficiency of experienced technicians. But they weren't human. Tall and pale, with arms that hung down past their knees and fingers that seemed to have too many joints. They wore what looked like work clothes, coveralls, and tool belts, but the proportions were wrong, designed for bodies that followed different architectural principles than human anatomy. When they noticed me, they didn't seem surprised or alarmed. One of them approached my truck, moving with a flowing gait that suggested joints bending in directions human joints couldn't accommodate. It reached through my open window and handed me a work order. The paper felt normal, but the text was written in symbols that shouldn't have been comprehensible to human eyes. Yet somehow, I could read it. My new assignment, maintaining the connection points between their network and ours. Ensuring signal clarity between dimensions. Facilitating communication between worlds that were growing closer every November. The work order included a map showing dozens of relay stations throughout the Appalachian Mountains, locations where the barriers between realities were naturally thin and could be exploited for interdimensional communication. Millbrook was just one node in a vast network that stretched across multiple states, all of it hidden inside the infrastructure we used for our simple human communications. At the bottom of the work order, in English that felt wrong coming from their symbols, was a single line: "Welcome to the November crew." I don't remember driving away from that clearing. I don't remember the trip back down the mountain or the route I took to get home. My next clear memory is sitting in my kitchen at 3 a.m., the work order still clutched in my hands, staring at my phone and knowing I could never go back to that job. I called in sick the next day, then the day after that. By the end of the week, I'd submitted my resignation, telling my supervisor I was moving to Florida for family reasons. I couldn't tell him that every time I looked at a utility pole, I could see the additional cables that weren't supposed to be there. Couldn't explain that when I drove past cell towers, I heard voices speaking in languages that made my nose bleed. That was 5 years ago. I work construction now, building houses and commercial buildings, doing work that involves only nuts and bolts and materials I can understand completely. I moved to Phoenix, as far from the mountains as I could get while staying in the lower 48. But every November, I start tasting metal again. Every November, my phone gets text messages with GPS coordinates leading back to places in the mountains where relay stations wait for maintenance visits. Every November, I hear voices on radio frequencies that don't exist, discussing signal improvements and network expansions and the growing success of interdimensional communication protocols. The messages always end the same way. Your shift starts at sunset, relay station assignments attached. The November crew is waiting. I've never gone back. But the messages keep coming, and every year they get more insistent. Last November, my GPS started showing the phantom roads even here in Phoenix, desert pathways that lead back toward the mountains I'd left behind. The voices on my radio have started using my name, discussing my work performance and assignment completion rates, like I'm an employee who's been skipping shifts. Mrs. Henderson still sends me Christmas cards every year, and she always mentions how perfect the cable service has been since I left. Crystal clear signals, internet faster than anything the city folks have, television programming that's more educational and entertaining than anything the major networks produce. She says it's like having access to shows and information from the future. It's almost like magic, she wrote in her last card. Like someone's taking real good care of us up here in the mountains. The truth is, I think they found someone else to maintain their network. Several someone else's, probably. The November crew is always recruiting new technicians, and there are a lot of small mountain communities where people wouldn't ask too many questions about improvements to their communication infrastructure. I think about those footprints sometimes, circling the utility pole 13 times before disappearing into the woods. I think about the work order that's still sitting in my kitchen drawer. The symbol's somehow more readable every time I look at it. I think about November and thin places and networks that bridge the gap between worlds. Mostly, I try not to think about the fact that I can still read the work orders when they arrive each November, or about how the phantom roads on my GPS are getting clearer and more detailed every year, or about how sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I catch myself heading east instead of wherever I was actually going, following routes that lead back toward mountains and maintenance shifts and voices that know my name. November's coming again soon. The text messages have already started. The metal taste is back, sharp and bitter on my tongue, and yesterday my radio picked up a voice that sounded almost like mine, discussing equipment upgrades and signal improvements, and welcoming the new crew members who've been recruited this year. I've been thinking maybe it's time to visit family, maybe it's time to go home. The November crew is always looking for experienced technicians, and they pay very well. Benefits include housing, meals, and communication access to places most people never dream of reaching. All you have to do is sign the work order and report for your first shift. The signals are getting stronger every year, and they're going to need all the help they can get. I was 29 and working substitute bus routes for Coal Creek County schools when everything changed. After my divorce that spring, I'd moved back to eastern Kentucky looking for steady work and cheap rent. Bus driving wasn't my dream job, but it paid $18 an hour and came with benefits I couldn't get waitressing. Most days I'd cover sick routes through familiar mountain towns where 3 generations of families still lived on the same haulers. Simple work, predictable work. Then November came, and with it, Route 7. Coal Creek's population had dropped to 450 people, scattered across 3 communities that barely qualified as towns anymore. The school district covered enormous territory because there just weren't enough children left to justify multiple buildings. Kids rode buses for over an hour each way, winding through mountain roads that hadn't been properly maintained since the coal money dried up. When Martha Hensley, the regular Route 7 driver, called in sick that cold November morning, my supervisor handed me keys to Bus 14 like it was routine business. "Remote route," Diane said, barely looking up from her coffee. "Picks up kids from scattered homes up Panther Mountain. You'll figure it out quick enough." I should have studied that route sheet more carefully. My GPS showed 17 official stops, but the printed schedule listed 23. The extra 6 had addresses that seemed impossible. Tall Pine Farm, beyond the old quarry. The Deep House, underground access road. Learning Center, follow the phosphorus lights. I figured they were outdated addresses, from families who'd moved away when the last mine closed. School districts in Appalachia are notorious for keeping dead addresses on their systems for years. November 16th, 6:30 a.m., first morning on Route 7. The mountain air tasted metallic and felt heavier than normal, like the pressure drops before a severe storm. But the weather forecast had called for clear skies. My headlights cut through fog so thick it seemed to cling to the windshield, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the mist was following the bus instead of just hanging in the valleys like fog should. The first 6 stops went exactly as expected. Regular kids emerged from trailer homes and small houses, their breath making clouds in the morning cold. They climbed aboard with the practiced efficiency of children who'd been riding school buses their whole lives, settling into familiar seats and starting quiet conversations about homework and weekend plans. At the 7th stop, 3 children approached the bus who weren't on my roster. They moved wrong, too smoothly, like they were gliding instead of walking. All 3 were pale to the point of looking translucent, thin in a way that suggested malnutrition, but their clothes were clean and properly fitted. When they climbed the bus steps, I noticed their feet barely made sound on the metal treads. "Morning," I said automatically, checking my clipboard. "What are your names?" The tallest child, maybe 10 years old, tilted her head at an angle that was just slightly too far. "We ride to learning," she said. Her voice sounded like an echo of a voice, somehow both flat and hollow. They seated themselves in the very back, sitting perfectly straight with their hands folded in their laps. When I adjusted the rearview mirror to keep an eye on all my passengers, all 3 were staring directly at me. Their eyes were completely black, not dark brown or deep blue, but black like looking into empty wells. And they never blinked. The regular kids acted like the 3 newcomers didn't exist. Tommy Morrison, a chatty 8th grader who usually filled the bus with stories about his hunting dogs, sat right in front of them and never turned around. Sarah Beth Collins, who knew everyone in the county and their family histories going back 4 generations, didn't acknowledge them at all. November 17th brought 4 more unauthorized passengers. They appeared at stops that weren't on my official route, standing beside dirt roads that my GPS insisted didn't exist, but Bus 14 seemed to know where to find them. The vehicle would slow down and pull over at locations I didn't recognize, and more pale children would board with that same unnatural silence. That's when I started hearing their whispered conversations. "The teacher is waiting in the deep classroom today. Remember to practice surface behaviors during transport. Study the warm ones. Note how they breathe, how their hearts sound." The unauthorized children were watching the regular kids with the intensity of scientists observing lab specimens. They copied how Tommy slouched in his seat, mimicked Sarah Beth's habit of twirling her hair, imitated the way the younger kids swung their legs. But their movements were slightly delayed, like they were processing and replaying behaviors they didn't naturally understand. By November 18th, the bus route was taking 3 hours instead of the usual 90 minutes. My GPS continued showing the correct path, but we seemed to be driving through expanded geography. The same mountain roads stretched longer than they should, winding through valleys I'd never seen before, despite living in eastern Kentucky my entire life. The air inside the bus started tasting different too. Metallic and old, like breathing in the scent of wet limestone. The temperature dropped even though the heater was running full blast, and frost began forming on the inside of the windows despite the outside temperature being in the 40s. We were visiting locations multiple times, but each visit showed a different version of the same places. A farmhouse that was freshly painted white during the morning pickup appeared weathered gray and abandoned when we returned in the afternoon. Roads curved in opposite directions. Creek beds that ran east suddenly flowed west. The unauthorized children disembarked at impossible destinations. They walked calmly down dirt paths that led directly into solid rock faces, disappeared into what appeared to be cave mouths disguised as normal driveways, and followed roads that literally vanished behind them as they walked, leaving nothing but undisturbed forest. I tried to follow one group with my eyes. 3 pale children stepped off the bus and walked toward what looked like a normal farmhouse. But as they approached the building, I could see it wasn't a house at all. It was an entrance carved into the mountainside, camouflaged with a painted facade that only looked convincing from the road. The children disappeared inside, and the fake house shimmered and dissolved, leaving nothing but granite cliff face. The regular kids never noticed any of this. They chatted about their classes, complained about homework, made plans for weekend activities. When I asked Tommy if he'd seen where those other kids went, he looked confused and said, "What other kids? It's just us regular riders on this route." November 19th, everything became clear. I realized I was transporting students to an underground school system that existed parallel to the surface world. Hidden beneath Panther Mountain was an entire educational complex where pale, ancient children learned to impersonate human kids. They studied breathing patterns, heart rates, sleep cycles, emotional responses. They practiced human behaviors like actors rehearsing for roles they didn't understand but needed to perform perfectly. And the regular children? They were the curriculum, living textbooks being studied, cataloged, and copied. The bus route had become a shuttle service between 2 worlds. I was bringing surface children down for observation and returning their underground replacements to the surface. But I was no longer in control of where we went. Route 7 was driving itself, following roads that existed in both realities simultaneously. The steering wheel would turn without my input, following paths that my GPS couldn't map but that Bus 14 knew by memory. We descended into tunnel systems that opened from normal-looking farm driveways, drove through caverns lit by phosphorescent moss that grew in patterns too regular to be natural, past classroom windows carved directly into living rock where dozens of pale children sat at stone desks, practicing handwriting with charcoal sticks. Through those windows, I glimpsed their lessons. They were learning human names, memorizing family histories, studying photographs of the regular kids they would eventually replace. Each pale child had a file folder containing detailed behavioral observations. Subject: Tommy Morrison. Scratches behind left ear when nervous. Speaks about hunting dogs to mask anxiety about father's drinking. Sleeps poorly due to nightmares about mine collapse that killed grandfather. November 20th, I tried to resist the route. I attempted to drive only to the 17 official stops, ignoring the additional addresses, but Bus 14 wouldn't obey. The vehicle pulled over at unauthorized locations despite my efforts to maintain speed. The brake pedal depressed itself. The steering wheel locked in position until the pale children had boarded. When I tried to skip the underground portions of the route entirely, the bus began driving in circles. The road ahead would curve back on itself, creating an impossible loop that continued until I surrendered and allowed the vehicle to descend into the tunnels. The regular children never seemed to notice that their daily 90-minute ride had become a 3-hour journey through an underground world. They remained unaware that they were being studied by beings who viewed them as specimens rather than individuals. During one underground segment, I overheard a conversation between 2 pale instructors standing beside their stone classroom. They spoke in voices that sounded like wind moving through dry leaves. The Morrison subject shows promise. His replacement has nearly mastered the breathing patterns and nervous gestures. What about the Collins girl? Her emotional displays are complex. Still studying her grief response to pet loss, the replacement needs more practice with tear production and voice modulation during distress. That's when I understood the full scope of what I was participating in. This wasn't just observation. It was preparation for wholesale replacement. November 21st, I discovered I wasn't the first substitute driver. In the underground depot, where Bus 14 refueled with a substance that glowed faintly blue, I found maintenance records dating back decades. Martha Hensley's name appeared on duty rosters, but so did names I recognized from local obituaries. Drivers who had supposedly died in car accidents, heart attacks, sudden illnesses, they were all still there. In a sense. I saw them through the depot windows, sitting behind the wheels of identical yellow buses, driving endless routes through the underground network. Their eyes had turned black, and they moved with that same unnatural smoothness as the pale children. I realized that Route 7 drivers didn't retire or quit. They became permanent employees of the underground school system, forever shuttling between worlds, facilitating the gradual replacement of surface children with their underground counterparts. November 22nd, my supervisor called, asking why I'd missed all my shifts that week. "You haven't reported to work since Monday, Maria. The Route 7 kids have been getting emergency transport with other drivers." But I'd been driving every single day. I'd logged every mile, followed every stop, transported those children exactly as the route required. I had the fuel receipts to prove it, the mileage records, the daily reports I'd filled out in my own handwriting. That's when I understood the final truth. The underground route existed parallel to the surface route, serving the same children but in different realities. Route 7 ran simultaneously in both worlds, and I'd been pulled into the wrong version. I was trapped in a shuttle system that would never end, forever transporting children between surface and underground schools, facilitating an exchange program that would gradually replace every child in Coal Creek County with pale imitations. But somehow, on November 23rd, I found a way out. During one underground segment, I noticed an emergency exit marked with symbols I couldn't read but somehow understood. While the pale children were disembarking for their classes, I abandoned Bus 14 and ran. I emerged from what appeared to be an old mine shaft about 3 miles from my apartment. The morning sun felt too bright after days in phosphorescent caverns. The air tasted thin and clean instead of metallic and heavy. My phone showed 17 missed calls from my supervisor and 3 days' worth of unread text messages. I never went back to finish that route. I called in sick, then quit as soon as Diane found a replacement driver. I told everyone I'd had a family emergency in another state, packed my things, and moved to Lexington within a week. But Coal Creek County wouldn't let me go completely. 6 months later, while grocery shopping, I saw Tommy Morrison with his mother in the cereal aisle. He looked exactly the same as always, but something was wrong with his breathing. Too steady, too controlled, like it was a conscious effort instead of an automatic function. When he scratched behind his left ear, the gesture was perfectly timed, as if he'd practiced it in front of a mirror. His mother didn't seem to notice, but I could see that her son had been replaced with something that had studied him carefully enough to fool everyone who loved him. I don't drive school buses anymore. Can't handle being responsible for children's transportation, knowing what I know about where some routes really lead. I work in an office building now, processing insurance claims for a company that deals only with surface world problems. But sometimes, late at night, I still dream about Bus 14. I dream I'm back behind the wheel, driving Route 7 through phosphorescent tunnels, watching pale children study real kids like they're preparing for the most important exam of their lives. And in those dreams, I realize that I never actually escaped. I'm still driving that route, still transporting children between worlds, still part of a system that's replacing human children one bus ride at a time. Because some routes never really end, they just keep running, picking up passengers, taking them to places they were never supposed to go. And once you've driven one of those routes, part of you never leaves the driver's seat. To this day, I check local obituaries from Coal Creek County. Every few months, another family reports the sudden death of a child from an unexplained illness. The funeral notices always mention how peaceful the child looked, how they seemed to simply stop breathing in their sleep. But I know better. Those children aren't dead. They're underground, being studied in stone classrooms by pale instructors who need to understand every detail of human behavior before sending their replacements to the surface. And somewhere beneath Panther Mountain, Bus 14 is still running Route 7. Still picking up children who think they're going to school, still taking them to classrooms where they become specimens instead of students. The driver looks exactly like me. Same hair, same uniform, same nervous habit of adjusting the rearview mirror. But her eyes have turned black, and she moves with that unnatural smoothness that comes from being part of the underground system. She drives the route I was supposed to finish, the one I abandoned when I ran. And every day, she transports more children between worlds, facilitating replacements that fool everyone except the people who know what to look for. I still live in Kentucky, but I stay far from the mountains now. No hollers, no coal towns, no communities small enough that everyone knows everyone. Because I learned that in places like Coal Creek, where the population gets smaller every year, Sometimes the reason people disappear isn't that they've moved away. Sometimes it's because something else has moved in, wearing their faces, breathing with their lungs, living their lives well enough to fool the people who loved them. And sometimes, on November nights when the fog rolls thick through the valleys, I can still hear the sound of Bus 14's engine echoing through the mountains, picking up passengers for a route that never ends. Back when I was 29, I thought I understood what death looked like. 3 years working night shifts at Millbrook General Hospital in West Virginia had shown me plenty of it. Our little town of 850 people might seem peaceful during the day, but at night, when you're the only medical facility for 40 miles in any direction, you see things that would make most people reconsider their career choices. I'd taken the job right after nursing school because the pay was better than anything I could find in Charleston, and honestly, I liked the quiet. Most nights it was just me, whoever was on call, and maybe 2 patients in the whole building. Mrs. Henderson with her chronic breathing problems, or old Mr. Kowalski sleeping off another bout with his heart. Simple cases, predictable patterns. November was always different though. Hunting accidents brought in their share of trauma, and the mountain cold seemed to settle into our elderly folks' bones like it was planning to stay. But there was something else about November that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The older staff members would get this distant look around the middle of the month, like they were listening for something the rest of us couldn't hear. Dr. Patterson, who'd been working there since before I was born, would start checking the supply closets obsessively, muttering about making sure we had enough epinephrine and saline. For what? I'd asked him once, but he'd just looked at me with those tired eyes and said, "You'll understand soon enough, Sarah." November 14th started like any other night. Just me, Dr. Patterson, and 2 patients. Mrs. Henderson, recovering from pneumonia in room 12, and Mr. Garcia sleeping peacefully after a mild cardiac episode. The hospital felt especially quiet that night, like the building itself was holding its breath. Even the usual sounds were wrong. The heating system that normally clanked and groaned through the night was completely silent. No wind rattling the windows, no distant traffic from Highway 52. Around 10:30, I was doing my rounds when I noticed Dr. Patterson standing in the supply room, counting IV bags. His lips were moving, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. When I approached, he looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, part sadness, part resignation. "How many years have you been here, Sarah?" he asked. 3 years this month, I said. "Dr. Patterson, is everything okay?" He was quiet for a long moment, then placed his hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have warned you. But honestly, I hoped maybe this year would be different." Before I could ask what he meant, the phone rang at the nurse's station. The sound seemed too loud in the unusual quiet, almost aggressive. I hurried to answer it, and the voice on the other end was crackling with static, like it was coming from very far away. "Millbrook General, this is County Dispatch. We've got multiple casualties coming in from a bus accident on Highway 52. Approximately 23 victims, various trauma levels. ATA 15 minutes. 23? I repeated, grabbing a pen to write down details. "What kind of injuries are we looking at? Do you need us to call in additional staff?" But the line had gone dead. Not hung up, dead. Complete silence, not even the dial tone. I looked back toward the supply room, but Dr. Patterson was gone. In fact, I realized I hadn't heard his footsteps leaving. The silence in the hospital had gotten thicker, like the air itself was becoming dense. I tried calling his cell phone, but my phone showed no signal. That was strange. We'd never had signal problems before. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. I kept watching the emergency entrance through the windows, but no ambulances came, no sirens, nothing. I was starting to think dispatch had made a mistake when I heard it. The distant sound of an engine approaching. But it wasn't the high whine of a modern ambulance. It was deeper, older, like the engines you hear in classic car documentaries. I looked outside and saw headlights coming up the drive, but they were the wrong shape. Round and yellowed, not the bright bars of modern emergency vehicles. The first ambulance that pulled up looked like something from a museum. Boxy, with rounded edges, and that faded red cross that hospitals used decades ago. The paramedics who got out were wearing uniforms I'd only seen in old photographs, the kind with stiff white shirts and dark blue pants without the reflective strips modern emergency responders wear. They wheeled in the first patient, an elderly man in clothes that immediately struck me as wrong. His suit was brown polyester, perfectly clean despite supposedly coming from a crash scene. His hair was styled in a way that reminded me of my grandfather's old photographs. But it was his skin that made my stomach drop. It wasn't just pale, it was gray, with that waxy texture I'd only seen on bodies that had been dead for hours. Bus went off the mountain road near Devil's Backbone, the paramedic reported, his voice oddly formal. Patient shows signs of severe trauma and shock. I started to check for vital signs, but there was no pulse, no breathing. His skin was cold as stone. I looked up at the paramedic to ask what was going on, but he was already heading back outside. "More coming in," he called over his shoulder. That's when Dr. Patterson reappeared, as silently as he'd left. He looked at the patient and nodded, like this was completely normal. "Get me 20 cc's of epinephrine," he ordered, "and prep the defibrillator." "Doctor," I whispered, leaning close to him. "He doesn't have a pulse. He's been dead for—" "I know what he is, Sarah," Dr. Patterson said quietly. "Just do what I say, please." Something in his voice made me comply, even though every instinct I had was screaming that this was wrong. I drew up the epinephrine with hands that were starting to shake, while Dr. Patterson went through the motions of examining a man who was clearly beyond any help we could provide. The second patient came in while I was still trying to process what was happening. A middle-aged woman with massive head trauma, wearing a floral dress that looked like something from the 1970 seconds. Her injuries were obviously fatal, had been for a long time based on the condition of the wound, but the paramedics were giving us a full report as if we could somehow save her. More patients kept coming, each one obviously deceased, each one wearing clothes that seemed decades out of date. Bell-bottom jeans, polyester shirts, hairstyles I'd only seen in my mother's old yearbooks. But everyone, the paramedics, Dr. Patterson, even other staff members who had appeared from somewhere, was treating this like a completely normal night. I found myself going through the motions automatically, but something was happening to my voice. When I tried to ask questions, the words came out distant and hollow, like I was speaking from the bottom of a well. My hands were moving on their own, following procedures I'd learned in nursing school, but part of my mind was watching from a distance, horrified. Between patients, I managed to slip away to check the patient log. What I found made the room spin around me. The same names, the same accident, logged for every November 15th, going back to 1974. A bus crash that had killed 23 people, members of the Millbrook Community Choir returning from a performance in Charleston. But it was the staff notes that really chilled me. Each year, the same routine, the same impossible patients, receiving the same futile care. And each year, a new staff member's name appeared on the permanent roster. Nurses and doctors who had worked that night and never gone home. I kept reading, my hands shaking. The original night nurse, who had treated the accident victims in 1973. Her name was still on the schedule for every November 15th. So was the doctor who had been on call, and the orderly who had helped move the bodies. All of them, year after year, coming in to care for the dead. I looked for Dr. Patterson's name and found it added in 1987. 14 years he'd been doing this. 14 years of watching new staff members get pulled into whatever this was. That's when I noticed my own reflection in the glass of the medicine cabinet. It was getting fainter. My skin was starting to turn the same gray color as the patient's. The fluorescent lights seemed to pass right through me, like I was becoming translucent. Dr. Patterson appeared behind me in the reflection. His face was sad but not surprised. "I tried to warn you, Sarah," he said softly, "but it doesn't make any difference. The hospital needs us. They need us." "Who needs us?" I whispered, but even as I asked, I understood. The patients. The 23 people who had died on November 15th, 1973. When their charter bus had gone off Devil's Backbone curve in a sudden snowstorm, they came back every year on the anniversary. And someone had to care for them. Someone had to try to save them, even knowing it was impossible. "Why?" I asked. "Why do we have to keep doing this?" Dr. Patterson's reflection met my eyes in the glass. "Because that's what we do," he said. "We're healers. We don't give up even when there's no hope, even when it's been 50 years. I tried to run for the exit, but my legs felt like they were moving through thick water. Everything was slowing down around me, the world becoming dreamlike and distant. More accident victims kept arriving, and I kept treating them, my hands moving automatically while my mind screamed. I checked the clock, 3:17 a.m. In my peripheral vision, I could see other staff members I didn't recognize. Nurses in outdated uniforms, doctors with equipment from decades past, all of them working silently on patients who would never recover, in a routine that had been repeating for 50 years. The transformative pull was getting stronger. I could feel my connection to the living world getting thinner, like a rope fraying strand by strand. But I fought it. I focused on my life outside these walls, my apartment, my cat, my sister who lived in Pittsburgh. Real things that anchored me to the world of the living. "You can't fight it forever," Dr. Patterson said, not looking up from the patient he was examining. I tried for 3 months. Came back every night, thinking I could figure out what was happening, thinking I could stop it. But you can't save the dead, Sarah. You can only join them. But I wasn't giving up that easily. I managed to grab my phone and tried calling 911, but the screen showed no signal, no time, no anything, just a faint gray glow. I stumbled toward the main entrance, but the doors wouldn't budge. Not locked. They just wouldn't move, like they'd become part of the wall. The windows showed nothing but darkness outside. Not the parking lot, not the road, just an endless black void. We weren't in the real hospital anymore. We were somewhere else, somewhere that existed only on November 15th, in the space between life and death. That's when I realized what Dr. Patterson meant about not being able to warn anyone. Every year, the hospital would hire a new night nurse. Every year, that nurse would work normally for most of November, never knowing what was coming. And every year, on the 15th, they would find themselves pulled into this eternal shift, caring for people who had been dead for decades. The real horror wasn't the dead patients. It was the slow understanding that this was forever. That I would spend eternity in this shadow version of the hospital, going through the motions of saving people who couldn't be saved, while new victims got added to the cycle year after year. When November 16th came in the real world, the day shift found my car in the parking lot and my belongings in my locker. But I was never seen again. The hospital administration was baffled by my disappearance, but after a week of searching, they did what they always do. They hired a new night nurse. Her name was Rebecca Torres, and she was 26 years old, fresh out of nursing school and eager to start her career. She had no idea that every November 15th, she would discover what happened to me, that she would learn the true meaning of the Hippocratic Oath, to do no harm and to never stop trying, even when trying becomes its own form of damnation. I still work at Millbrook General, in the space between worlds that exists only in November. I still care for the victims of that long-ago bus crash, still check for pulses that will never come, still administer medications that can't heal the dead. And every year, I watch as another living person gets pulled into our endless shift. The worst part isn't the repetition or the futility. It's the moment when each new nurse realizes what's happening, when they understand that their compassion has become their trap. Because healers don't abandon their patients, even when those patients abandoned life 50 years ago. Sometimes I wonder if the choir members know what they've done to us, if they understand that their need for care has created this cycle of entrapment. But mostly, I just do my job. Because that's what nurses do. We care for the sick, we comfort the dying, and apparently, we tend to the dead. And next November, Rebecca will understand why I could never warn her, why Dr. Patterson could never warn me. Because some truths can only be learned through experience, and some compassion can never be escaped. The hospital still operates normally for 11 months of the year, but every November 15th, it becomes something else. A place where the boundary between life and death grows thin, and where those sworn to heal discover that some duties transcend mortality itself. That's the real horror of small Appalachian towns. It's not the isolation or the poverty or the old superstitions. It's the way good people can become trapped by their own goodness, bound forever to care for those who can never truly be saved. I'm 38 years old, and I've been running elections in Harmony County, Virginia, for 12 years now. It's not glamorous work, but somebody's got to do it, and honestly, I take pride in making sure everyone gets their say. Harmony County isn't much to look at anymore. We're down to maybe 425 registered voters spread across 3 little mountain towns that are basically dying. Most of the young folks moved away for work, and the older generation is, well, they're passing on. But democracy doesn't stop just because a place gets small, you know? That's what I always told myself anyway. The 2020 presidential election was going to be my biggest challenge yet. Half our poll workers had either moved away or died in the past few years, and I was determined to run things fair and square, despite being short-staffed. We'd always held voting at the old Harmony High School, same place we'd used for decades, ever since I was a kid. The building's been empty since they consolidated the schools back in 2018, but the county still owned it, and the voting setup was already there. November 3rd, 6 a.m. sharp, I opened the polls with just 2 poll workers besides myself, Mrs. Chen, who'd been doing this almost as long as me, and Jake Morrison, a college kid home for the week who needed some extra cash. I was expecting maybe 200 voters throughout the day, which was pretty typical for our area. Nothing fancy, just neighbors doing their civic duty. The gymnasium felt wrong from the moment I unlocked those heavy doors. The air hung too thick, like it does before a bad storm. But the weather service had called for clear skies. My breath misted slightly, even though the heat was working fine. I could hear it humming in the walls. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder than usual, casting harsh shadows that seemed to bend at impossible angles across the old basketball court. The first hour went exactly like always, familiar faces trickling in before work, people I'd known my whole life. Old Mr. Peterson from up on Ridge Road, the Williamson family from town, Sarah Beth who runs the little market, everyone chatting about the weather and complaining about their backs. Normal stuff, but I kept catching whiffs of something under the usual school smell of old wood and cleaning supplies, something metallic and sweet, like pennies left in rainwater. Around 10 a.m., I started seeing people I hadn't seen in years. Former residents who'd moved away to find work in bigger cities, Richmond, Charlotte, even some who'd gone as far as Atlanta. I figured they'd just come back to vote in their hometown, maybe visiting family for the holiday. It happens sometimes, especially in presidential years. But then Mr. Henderson walked in around 10:30, looking exactly like he always had. Same flannel shirt, same John Deere cap, same slow shuffle from his bad hip. He handed me his voter registration card with those thick, calloused fingers I remembered from when he used to fix our truck. The paper felt ice cold against my palm, cold enough that I almost dropped it. When I looked up from checking his information, Mr. Henderson's eyes were the wrong color. They'd always been brown, but now they were this pale, watery blue, like creek ice in winter. When he breathed, no mist came out, even though mine still was. "Everything all right, Linda?" he asked, and his voice was exactly the same as I remembered. A little raspy from years of smoking, with that mountain accent that never quite leaves. The thing is, Mr. Henderson had died of a heart attack 3 years ago. I'd been to his funeral. I'd watched them lower his casket into the ground at Harmony Baptist Cemetery, and I'd brought his widow a casserole for 3 weeks after. My hands started trembling as I checked him in. But what else was I going to do? Challenge a dead man's right to vote? The registration system showed his information clear as day. Address, signature, everything matched. My throat felt tight, like I was breathing through wet wool. Just need to verify a few things, Mr. Henderson. I managed. He smiled at me, the same kind smile I remembered, but his teeth looked too white. Too many of them. "No rush, Linda. Got all the time in the world." 20 minutes later, Mrs. Chang came through the door. She'd passed from COVID earlier that same year, back in March. I'd sent flowers to her family. I remembered the obituary in the county paper, remembered thinking how unfair it was she'd been so careful, barely left her house. But here she was, wearing that same blue cardigan she always wore to vote, smiling at me like nothing had happened. When she handed me her registration card, her skin felt like wet newspaper, cold and somehow fragile, like it might tear if I touched it too hard. The air around her smelled like the inside of an old refrigerator, stale and chemical. "Beautiful day for democracy," she said in her careful English. But when she spoke, I could see her breath in little puffs, even though the gymnasium was warm enough that I'd taken off my sweater. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my fingertips. Mrs. Chen and Jake were processing other voters, acting like everything was normal. Couldn't they see what I was seeing? When I glanced over at them, they looked fuzzy around the edges, like I was seeing them through dirty glass. Then came the teenagers. Kids who'd died in car accidents decades ago, but now they looked elderly. Tommy Morrison, Jake's older brother, who'd wrapped his Camaro around a tree in 1987, walked in looking like he was in his 50s. The crash had happened when he was 17. I'd been just a kid then, but I remembered the funeral. The whole town had shown up. Tommy's face was wrong. The bones were the same shape, but the skin hung loose in some places and pulled too tight in others. When he moved, he made this soft rustling sound, like autumn leaves being stirred by wind. His clothes were the same ones they'd buried him in, that leather jacket from the high school football team, but now they were too small for his aged body. The sleeves rode up to show wrists that were nothing but yellow bone wrapped in skin like old leather. All of them had valid registration cards. All their names were on the rolls. Everything was legally correct. But they weren't voting for the current candidates. "I need to vote for Kennedy," Mrs. Chang said when I tried to explain the ballot. Her voice sounded far away, like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. "John Kennedy, he's going to help us with the civil rights." The ballot in my hands felt warm, then hot, then burning. I almost dropped it as the printed names began to shift and blur, reforming into different words, different years. Biden and Trump faded away, replaced by names I recognized from history books. Mr. Henderson wanted to vote for Ronald Reagan. "That movie actor fellow," he said, and when he spoke, tiny ice crystals formed in the air between us. "Heard he's running for governor out in California." The room felt like it was tilting. The basketball hoops at either end of the gymnasium stretched and warped, becoming impossibly tall. The windows showed daylight, but the quality of light kept changing. Sometimes the harsh fluorescent light of 2020, sometimes the softer yellow glow of decades past. "I'm voting for Roosevelt," declared a woman I didn't recognize, dressed in 1,940 seconds, clothing that looked like it had been buried in dirt for years. The fabric was stained and rotting, hanging off her skeletal frame in tatters. "Franklin Roosevelt. He's going to get us through this depression." Her voice echoed strangely, and when she spoke, dust fell from her mouth. Ancient dust, the kind that accumulates in places no one has visited for decades. By noon, the air in the gymnasium had turned thick as syrup. Every breath tasted of copper pennies and old flowers. The ballot box was filling up with votes from the past 80 years. I could hear the papers rustling inside it, whispering like a nest of insects. Dead voters casting ballots for dead politicians in campaigns that had ended before I was born. My hands moved without my brain telling them to, stamping forms, checking signatures, feeding ballots into machines that hummed and clicked with sounds they'd never made before. The electronic displays flickered between numbers from different decades, showing impossible tallies for elections that had happened in years when electronic voting didn't exist. The count kept climbing. 300 votes. 500. 800. We only had 425 registered voters in the entire county, but the dead kept coming. They filed in wearing the clothes they'd been buried in, carrying registration cards printed on paper that crumbled to dust when the wind from the heating system touched it. Around 4 p.m., I saw myself. She walked through the door like any other voter, but she was me, 20 years older, maybe 30. Gray hair pulled back in the same ponytail I always wore, but streaked with white. Deeper lines around her eyes, hands more gnarled from arthritis, but unmistakably me. She moved with a slight limp I didn't have yet, and when she handed me her registration card, her fingers were ice cold. "You'll understand eventually," she said, and her voice was exactly mine, just warier, sadder. "We all have to take our turn." The card she handed me was dated 2047. Her address was listed as Harmony County Election Office, permanent resident. I tried to speak, tried to ask what she meant, but my throat had closed up completely. She cast her ballot for candidates I'd never heard of, people who probably hadn't been born yet, then walked back toward the doors. Just before she left, she turned back to look at me. "It's not so bad," she said. "You get used to the cold." By 6 p.m., entire families were streaming in, 4 and 5 generations of the same bloodlines, all wanting to vote. Children too young to register stood next to great-grandparents who'd been dead for decades. The Garner clan, the Washingtons, no relation, despite the name, the Petersons stretching back to the 1800s. All of them voting in elections from different eras, their ballots feeding into a machine that had somehow become a swirling vortex of paper and time and democratic duty. The gymnasium stretched and contracted around us like a breathing thing. Sometimes it was the familiar old basketball court where I'd watched games as a kid. Sometimes it was larger, accommodating crowds from elections I'd never seen. Sometimes it was smaller, just a simple wooden schoolroom with desks in rows and a pot-bellied stove in the corner. 8 p.m. came and went. Polls were supposed to close, but the dead don't follow business hours. The fluorescent lights had dimmed to candle brightness, and the shadows on the walls moved independently of the people casting them. My breath came out in clouds now, and frost was forming on the voting machines. Mrs. Chen and Jake were still there, but they'd become translucent. I could see through them to the basketball court lines painted on the floor behind them. When they spoke, their voices sounded like recordings played through broken speakers. "Final count, Linda?" Mrs. Chen asked, but her lips didn't quite match the words. The tally on my screen showed 12,847 votes for candidates spanning 150 years. Harmony County had somehow voted in every election since its founding, all at the same time. The screen flickered between different fonts, different layouts, different technologies that shouldn't have been able to display on the same monitor. I tried calling the state election office on my cell phone, but when I looked at the screen, the numbers kept changing. Sometimes it showed 2020, sometimes 1,987, sometimes dates that hadn't happened yet. When I finally got through to someone, they couldn't seem to hear me properly. "Linda, you're breaking up. Just send us the normal results, okay?" My voice sounded hollow and distant even to me, like I was speaking from inside a tunnel. In the background of their office, I could hear the sounds of a busy election day from some other year, typewriters clacking, rotary phones ringing, people talking about candidates I'd never heard of. So, I submitted the official count, 198 votes for the current candidates. Biden won the county, like everyone expected, but I kept all those other ballots locked in my office filing cabinet. Evidence of something I still don't understand. When I finally left the school that night, the temperature outside was normal. My car started fine, my phone showed the right date, and the radio played contemporary songs. But in my rearview mirror, I could see lights still burning in the gymnasium windows and shadows moving behind the glass long after I'd locked the doors. Every November since then, they come back. The dead voters, returning to participate in democracy. I see Mr. Henderson every election day, still wearing that John Deere cap, his eyes still that wrong pale blue. Mrs. Chang always votes the straight Democratic ticket from 1964, her skin still feeling like damp paper under my fingers. The Garner family shows up as a group, spanning generations that shouldn't be able to exist in the same room, all of them smelling like dirt and old flowers. And every year, the gymnasium gets a little colder. Every year, Mrs. Chen and Jake look a little more transparent. Every year, I look a little more like that older version of myself who handed me a registration card from 2047. I'm still counting their votes. From elections that never seem to end. Sometimes I catch glimpses of future elections too. Candidates who haven't been born yet, voting on issues we can't even imagine. In a world I won't live to see but somehow know I'll be there to supervise. Looking back now, I think Harmony County's polls never really close. Democracy continues even after the voters and the candidates are long gone. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe that's how it's always been, and I just never noticed before. I still run elections here, and I'll keep running them until someone else takes over. Because in Harmony County, everyone gets to vote, the living, the dead, and everyone in between. But mostly the dead. The cold doesn't bother me as much as it used to. I was 41 when I started driving Route 9, and I've been hauling passengers through the haulers of eastern Kentucky for 15 years now. People think bus driving is just point A to point B, but out here in coal country, it's different. You're connecting communities that time forgot, carrying folks who don't have cars or lost their licenses to drinking, taking grandmothers to see doctors in Hazard when their own kids can't be bothered to drive them. Route 9 wasn't much to look at on paper, just 6 small towns strung together by twisting mountain roads that followed creek beds and ridgelines carved out back when coal was king. Blackwater, Millfield, Cedar Creek, Pine Ridge, Thornton, and Coalburg. Most people couldn't find these places on a map if their lives depended on it. Hell, GPS doesn't even recognize half the roads I take. November always hit these mountains hard. The leaves were gone by then, leaving the trees looking like skeleton hands reaching up through the fog that settled in the valleys every morning. This was when I carried mostly elderly folks heading to medical appointments, and the occasional person trying to get to a job interview or court date. The younger people had mostly moved away, chasing work in Lexington or Louisville, leaving behind empty houses and old-timers who remembered when these towns had names that meant something. I'd been driving the same 2015 International with 35 seats for the past 6 years. Knew every rattle, every place where the engine had to work harder on the steep grades. Knew my passengers, too. Mrs. Hazel Cooper from Blackwater, who rode to town every Tuesday for groceries and always brought me a thermos of coffee that was better than anything you could buy. Jimmy Watson, a good kid trying to get his life together after some trouble with pills, always dressed up nice when he had a job interview. November 12th started like any other Tuesday morning. Picked up Mrs. Cooper at the Blackwater Depot at 7 a.m. sharp, same as always. She climbed aboard with her shopping bags and that thermos, settling into her usual seat right behind me. "Morning, Mike. Heard they might get some snow up on Pine Mountain later this week." "Morning, Mrs. Cooper. Coffee smells good as always." Jimmy got on at the next stop, wearing his one good shirt and looking nervous. He'd been trying to get on at the power company for months, and today was another interview. Kid had been clean for almost a year now, and I was rooting for him. As we climbed up out of the valley, winding through the hairpin turns toward Millfield, I noticed something in my rearview mirror that made me do a double take. A young woman was sitting in the back, maybe early 20s, wearing a denim jacket that looked like it came from the 1990 seconds. She was staring out the window with this intense focus, like she was memorizing every tree we passed. I couldn't remember her getting on. That bothered me more than it should have, because I was careful about my passenger count. The county required detailed logs, and I'd never missed marking someone down in 15 years of driving. At Millfield, more people got on. A family with 2 small children. The kids were quiet, which was unusual. Kids are never quiet on buses. Some teenagers with backpacks, though I couldn't think of any high school in these parts that would have students traveling this direction. A man in a business suit with a briefcase, which was strange because there wasn't any business to speak of in these mountains anymore. But here's the thing that should have scared me right then. I watched them all get on in my mirror, but I don't remember stopping the bus. By Cedar Creek, my passenger count was wrong. Way wrong. I had 47 people on a 35-seat bus, with folks standing in the aisles, but somehow the weight distribution felt normal. The bus wasn't riding low, the engine wasn't straining any more than usual, and Mrs. Cooper and Jimmy were acting like nothing had changed, just sitting there like it was any other Tuesday. I started feeling dizzy as we climbed toward Pine Ridge. The air was getting thick, like before a storm, and I was having trouble catching my breath. My hands were starting to shake on the steering wheel, and there was this metallic taste in my mouth that reminded me of old pennies. That's when I started hearing the conversations. Low voices, talking about things that sounded familiar, but wrong somehow. A woman discussing her chemotherapy schedule, saying the doctors were optimistic about shrinking the tumor. Teenagers arguing about which college they were going to attend. An old man talking excitedly about his grandson's wedding next month. I recognized that voice. Mr. Chen, who used to ride my route every Friday to visit his daughter in Hazard. But Mr. Chen had died last winter. Heart attack in his sleep, according to his daughter when she called to cancel his regular ride. I adjusted my rearview mirror to get a better look at the passengers, and that's when I saw her, Mrs. Ada Patterson, sitting 3 rows back, reading a magazine. Mrs. Patterson had been one of my regulars for almost 5 years, riding to her cancer treatments twice a week until she couldn't make the trips anymore. I'd driven her to her last appointment 2 years ago, helped her down from the bus when she was too weak to manage the steps alone. She died 3 weeks later. But there she was, looking healthier than I'd ever seen her, talking quietly to the woman next to her about vacation plans for next summer. I pulled over at Pine Ridge, with my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. Turned around in my seat to get a full count of passengers, and the bus was empty, except for Mrs. Cooper and Jimmy. "You feeling all right, Mike?" Mrs. Cooper asked, concern in her voice. "You look pale as a sheet. Where did everyone go?" "Everyone? Honey, it's just been the three of us all morning, same as always." I looked at my passenger log. 3 names written in my own handwriting: H. Cooper, J. Watson, and my signature at the bottom. But I could swear I'd just seen dozens of people. The rest of the route passed in a haze. I kept catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, hearing whispered conversations that cut off when I tried to focus on them. By the time I dropped Mrs. Cooper and Jimmy back at their stops, I was convinced I was having some kind of breakdown. November 15th, it happened again, but this time I was ready for it. The phantom passengers started boarding at Millfield, and I forced myself to watch carefully in my mirrors. They moved wrong. Too smooth. Like they were floating just slightly above the floor. Their conversations became clearer as we climbed higher into the mountains. Mrs. Patterson was talking about beating cancer, about the cruise she was going to take when she felt better. The Morrison twins, killed in a head-on collision with a drunk driver 3 years ago, were discussing their weekend plans, arguing about which movie to see at the theater in Hazard that had closed down in 2019. They were all talking about futures that would never happen, making plans for tomorrows they'd never see. November 18th, I realized the route itself was changing. We stopped at the Cedar Creek Depot, but the building had been demolished 2 years ago to make room for a Dollar General that never got built. I watched my phantom passengers get off the bus anyway, walking across the empty lot toward destinations that no longer existed. Mrs. Patterson headed toward the medical center that had closed when the last doctor in town retired. The Morrison twins walked hand in hand toward the lumber mill that had shut down after their deaths. I was still sitting behind the wheel, but my hands looked strange, translucent, like I could see through them to the steering wheel underneath. My reflection in the rearview mirror was fading at the edges, becoming less solid. November 22nd. I understood what was happening to me. The mountains outside my windows weren't quite the right shape anymore. The roads curved in directions that didn't match 15 years of muscle memory. I was driving through a version of eastern Kentucky that existed somewhere between memory and possibility, carrying passengers to places that lived only in the space between what was and what could have been. My own voice started joining their conversations. I heard myself talking about routes I'd never driven, passengers I'd never met, a wife and children I'd never had. In this other version of my life, I'd married Sarah Combs from high school instead of just dating her for 6 months. We'd had 2 kids, bought a little house in Blackwater, and I'd been driving Route 9, not because it was the only steady work, but because I loved these mountains and the people who called them home. The weight of unlived lives was filling my bus, and I was becoming part of that weight. November 25th was my last day in the world, you know. I was driving the route, but everything outside was wrong now. The mountains twisted in impossible directions, roads led to towns that had never been built, and the sky was the color of old photographs. My passengers were talking about children they'd never had, jobs they'd never gotten, love affairs that had ended before they began. And I was talking too, telling Mrs. Patterson about the grandchildren I'd never have, discussing with Jimmy the college I'd never attended, sharing with the Morrison twins the dreams I'd given up when I took this job to pay for my mother's medical bills after Dad died. We were all traveling to the same destination now, a place where November never ended, where the buses ran on schedule through mountains that existed only in the hearts of people who'd loved and lost and died before their stories were finished. My supervisor found my bus the next morning, engine still running, parked at the Blackwater Depot with the door standing open. The security footage showed me driving alone all week, but the fuel gauge indicated I'd driven nearly 800 miles, twice the distance of my regular route. Local folks will tell you they still see Route 9 running through these mountains, especially on November mornings when the fog is thick in the valleys. They say it picks up passengers who never got to finish their stories, people who died with words unspoken and dreams unfulfilled. And somewhere in the November mountains of eastern Kentucky, in a place that exists in the space between heartbeats, I'm still driving. 41 years old forever, carrying the weight of all the lives that could have been, helping souls find their way to destinations that exist only in the geography of regret. The county officially discontinued Route 9 after 3 more drivers quit, all reporting the same impossible experiences. They said the bus got too heavy with passengers who weren't there, that the roads led to places that didn't exist, that they started forgetting their own lives and remembering others instead. But if you find yourself on a mountain road in eastern Kentucky on a foggy November morning and you see an old bus with its lights on, headlights cutting through the mist, don't flag it down. Don't try to board. Because once you step onto Route 9, you become part of the story that never ends, part of the November that exists outside of time, part of the mountain's memory of all the people who loved these hollers and died before they could say goodbye. And I'll be there behind the wheel, driving through the eternal November, taking you wherever you need to go in the country of unfinished dreams.